Welcome everybody, my name is Lida Liberopoulou, and in this video we are going to discover the similarities between the real world Julius Caesar and Caesar from Fallout New Vegas. Are there really any? Let's find out. I remember when I first played the game how it gradually made me more interested about Caesar. You first get hints about the Legion here and there, and then you get hit in the face with a massacre at Nipton. You see the Legion banner, the lines of crucified bodies, then you get Vulpes Inculta with his vexillarius wolf head and the Legion troops with their padded sports equipment imitating the Lorica Segmentata armor. Eventually you get invited to an audience with Caesar, and as you get closer and closer to him, it's like you're going back in time. His fort loosely follows the structure of a Roman castrum of Caesar's era, with the ditch surrounding the walls, the rows of Papilius-style tents, and legionnaires going about their everyday chores. At the center is the great Praetorium tent, and inside is the man himself. If you ask him, he will talk extensively about his life, and here is where you start to get the obvious and not so obvious similarities with the life of Julius Caesar. Early life. The real name of the game Caesar was Edward Sallow. He was born in 2226 in the post-war ruins of Los Angeles, better known as the Boneyard. Anyone who has played Fallout 1 will remember the Boneyard as a gang-ridden area full of death claws. Julius, on the other hand, was born in 100 BC in the Subura, a slum district of Rome famous for its taverns and its brothels. However, unlike Edward, he was part of an ancient noble family. By the time of his birth, they had lost most of their power and wealth, but they were far from nobodies. His aunt had married one of the most powerful generals in Rome, Gaius Marius. He was the guy who reformed the Roman army and was the main opponent of the dictator Sulla. Also, Caesar's father served as a high-ranking magistrate in the Roman provinces. At the age of 6, Edward lost his father to an attack by raiders. Caesar also lost his father when he was young, but not to a violent death. Both had academic interest in linguistics. Edward was an anthropologist and a linguist. Caesar had studied rhetoric and languages. He even wrote 2 books on the grammar of Latin, which he dedicated to the orator Cicero. The most critical points in Edward's and Caesar's life seem to be very similar. They both had to leave their home at the age of 20. Edward was sent by the followers of the Apocalypse, the organization he was working for, on an expedition to the Grand Canyon to study the languages of the local tribes. Caesar was forced to leave Rome and serve under the Roman governor of Asia Minor to avoid the proscriptions of the dictator Sulla. Both were inspired by a notable figure from history. Edward, while traveling to the Grand Canyon, discovered a collection of old books which included Julius Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War and the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. Is he named Edward after Edward Gibbon? I just realized that. Moving on. According to the Fallout New Vegas official game guide collector's edition, reading Caesar's memoir was such a life-changing experience for him that it became the blueprint for his identity. Well, Julius Caesar also had a famous historical figure as his inspiration. When he was 30, he supposedly read books on the life of Alexander the Great, or in other versions of the story, he saw a statue of Alexander the Great. At that point, he realized that at the same age, Alexander had already conquered the world, while he was just the proconsul of a simple, remote Roman province. According to the historian Plutarch, this is what eventually drove him to the path of greatness. There's also the event that turned Edward from a scholar to a warlord. When we first meet him, he will describe how while exploring the Grand Canyon, he was abducted for ransom by one of the local tribes called the Blackfoots. The tribe was weak and about to be attacked by their enemies, so Edward, to avoid getting killed together with his captors, decided to teach them the methods of warfare he had learned from the old books. This resulted to the Blackfoots defeating their enemies and Caesar becoming their leader, and this is supposedly what started his conquest of the wasteland. Well, this sounds a lot like the one about Caesar and the pirates, and this story is so crazy I need to go into detail about it. So, when Caesar was traveling to Rhodes to attend the School of Rhetoric, his ship was captured by pirates. But when the pirates learned that he was from a noble family, they demanded 20 silver talents as ransom. Caesar, when he learned about it, said that he was far more valuable than that and told them to ask for 50 talents, which is almost 1.5 tons of silver. He then practiced his oratory skills on the pirates, which of course thought he was nuts. When the ransom was finally paid, he told them that he was going to find them and kill them. They just scoffed and let him go. He then raised a fleet with money from his own pocket and started hunting down all the pirate ships in the area. He eventually found the pirates that had captured him, defeated them, took back all the silver from his ransom and crucified every single one of them. But at least he was kind enough to slit their throats before doing so. All these critical events in Edward's life, leaving home, getting the inspiration to emulate Caesar, and starting his career as a warlord, happen in just 1 year in the game's story. In Julius Caesar's case, the equivalent critical events in his life, like escaping the proscriptions of the dictator Sulla, getting captured by pirates, and getting inspired by the life of Alexander the Great, have several years separating them. But despite all these deviations, it's surprising how many common elements are here. Rise to power. There's a clear parallel between Caesar's campaign in Gaul and Edward's conquest of the wasteland tribes, both in their efficiency and brutality. But of course, Caesar's armies were not conquered tribesmen forced to fight like Edward's legion, but they were free Roman citizens that were paid very well for their service. Even the auxiliary troops that came from the tribes of Gaul that Caesar used in his army were not slaves forced to fight for him, but paid volunteers fighting for the promise of Roman citizenship. Beyond the usual brutal warfare methods, Edward also uses manipulation and diplomacy to achieve his goals. He attempts to bring into the legion minor factions like the Great Khans by making alliances with them or influencing them in other ways. Caesar also used diplomacy and manipulation during his conquest of Gaul. He would do things like offer land and trade agreements to the friendly tribes and also make treaties with them. He was quite generous and also usually kept his promises. Edward, on the other hand, repeatedly makes it clear that he has contempt for these factions, and there's a lot of evidence that he doesn't aim to honor his agreements. As for Edward's ideas about history and the Roman Empire, the only thing I can say is that they are rather simplistic and that they exist only to serve his ambitions and grievances. In fact, I've already made a 3-part video series about this. You can find the link in the description. But besides all these parallels with Caesar's life we find in the main story, there are also some interesting little points in the game's secondary quests, the items, and even throwaway lines of dialogue. The son of gods. At the end of the main quest of the Legion, Lannius, Edward's second in command, refers to him as the son of Mars.
I am the commander of this army. The son of Mars has granted me the name Lannius, and the time to serve him has come once more.
Like Edward, Julius Caesar also claimed to be related to an actual Roman god, or rather his family did, and there is some connection between them and Mars through his ancestor and co-founder of Rome, Romulus. More specifically, Romulus' mother, Rhea Silvia. But his family was mostly connected to Venus, more specifically to Venus Genetrix, the founding mother version of the goddess, which was the mother of Aeneas, the ancestor of both Romulus and Remus. One of Venus' sacred animals was the bull, which is probably why Julius Caesar used it as the symbol on his coins and on the banner of his legions. We also see the bull on Edward's legion banners, the Mark of Caesar pennant, and on the rare Legion Aureus gold coins. There are also some other small details in the game's legion coins that relate to the real-world Caesar. I talk about them in more detail in my Legion Easter egg video, link in the description. Chrome Dome. Julius Caesar was bold and was quite self-conscious about it. He used his famous laurel wreath to hide it and even attempted a comb-over. You can even see this in the few marble busts that were made while he was still alive. Edward is also bold, but doesn't seem that bothered, although there are a couple of characters in-game that will throw snarky comments about his appearance.
Down to brass tacks. How'd your meet and greet with Baldy go?
Absolutely not. Caesar is of great use to me. I don't want you harming a hair on that man's head, assuming you could find one.
Fancy words. When you reach the final phase of the game, while playing on the side of the Legion, you will get the quest named Veni Vidi Vici. This is of course one of the most famous phrases uttered by Caesar and translates to I came, I saw, I conquered. It's a reference to the quick victory he had against the king of Pontus at the Battle of Zela in 47 BC. When Edward talks about how he defeated the Blackfoot enemies, he will use the phrase
Divide et impera,
which translates to divide and conquer. The phrase is attributed to Caesar, but he wasn't the first to say it. It has been used by others before him, like Alexander the Great's father, Philip II. It's also a very well-known military tactic that existed long before both Caesar and Philip. Stabbed in the back. Et Tumor Brute is the name of a Legion side quest, which is a clear play on another famous phrase associated with Caesar. The actual phrase, of course, was Et tu, Brute, and translates to you as well, Brutus, and was supposedly said by Caesar when he recognized his friend Brutus as one of his assassins. In the context of the game, the phrase and the quest itself refer to the severe headaches and blackouts that Edward has. They eventually prove to be a brain tumor that the player can attempt to cure or use as a subterfuge to murder him. Caesar also suffered from blackouts and headaches, which have been attributed to various conditions, from epilepsy to brain tumors. When you first meet Edward at the fort, you will get the dialogue option Death to Tyrants, which will of course result in him and his Praetorians becoming hostile and attacking you. This is a reference to the phrase Sic semper tyrannis, which translates to thus always to tyrants. It was supposedly said by Brutus when he stabbed Caesar. The Gunrunners DLC includes the quest Historical Propriety Challenge, where you have to kill Caesar with a knife. This is also a reference to Caesar's assassination, where he was stabbed 23 times. There's also the fact that when you meet Edward, he's 55 years old. Caesar was 56 years old when he was assassinated. This might be a hint that maybe Edward was not supposed to survive for long after the Battle of Hoover Dam. So, these are the references to the life of Julius Caesar I could find in the game. And the level of detail of these references is quite surprising. But there are some very interesting and prominent aspects of Caesar's life and personality that are completely missing from Edward's story. For example, Caesar was a notorious womanizer. Beyond the famous affair he had with Cleopatra, there are dozens of other stories. Even his legionnaires used to sing songs about it. And he was loved by the people of Rome. He was one of the few politicians of his time who went door to door in the poor neighborhoods where his voters were and implemented some very important reforms that made their lives easier. Perhaps the best way to show the extent of this love is to talk about what happened during his funeral. When the body was about to be cremated, the crowd mourning his death stormed the surrounding buildings, took the furniture and everything else they could find and added it to the funeral pyre. And when the fire was lit, they started throwing their own clothes and jewelry on the flames. The flames became so strong from the offerings that they damaged the buildings in the forum. This is the level of admiration that the people of Rome had for Caesar. Edward has none of this. He's respected and feared, but none of his followers seems to love or admire him. He's charmless and comes off as a grumpy old man with a chip on his shoulder, and we never see him among his troops talking to ordinary legionnaires. He always sits on his throne, surrounded by his praetorians and his lieutenants, and I think that's intentional. Just like Edward's legion is a simplistic totalitarian version of ancient Rome, so is Edward himself a pale and rather bitter imitation of Caesar. Obviously, the game designers didn't want to make Edward a grotesque caricature, but at the same time they didn't want to add the more humane and sympathetic aspects of his real-world counterpart. And that is because very often people who rise to power through violence look more like Edward than Caesar. This is probably my last video on the similarities and differences between Rome and the Legion. These were really fun to make, so I might get back to the game at some point. My next video is going to be on the Assassin's Creed series. Expect it to be out soon, and Ave atque Vale.